The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
Jeremy, why on earth did you ever want to get into radio?
Wow, that's a great question right off the hop. I always loved it growing up. Listened to it. My parents loved it. And, we used to listen to, grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver. So we listened to a lot of 1410 Fun with Fred and Kathy back in the 80s. And then when they made their jump over to Kiss, so did my parents. And so that was, they loved it. And I guess, I wanted to do something that I thought maybe they'd love. I loved it. I used to do the contest, in the morning. Mom and dad, dad would be getting ready to go off to the telecommunications company. And my mom worked for the school board and hustling our lunches. And the contest would come on and I'd try to win. And that was always really fun.
It sounds like a crazy thing now we used to all listen together to the radio.
Oh, yeah. It'd be like on in the kitchen while everyone's running around bonkers. And then, of course, driving. We didn't have 8 infotainment system in our car. We had the radio. So we listened to the radio in the car going everywhere. And grew up with a lot of those soft favorites of yesterday and today. You know what I mean? Like I will always love Billy Joel.
Where were you driving to? Was it off in school or was it activities?
Oh, yeah, all sorts of things. I had a couple brothers and a sister. So we all played sports and we all did music. We all did all the things.
What'd you play?
For me in school, it was a bass clarinet.
And sports-wise, what'd you play?
Hockey mostly, yeah.
So this is a very typical Canadian upbringing.
If you grew up in the suburbs in the 80s and 90s, 100%.
And so when it came to schooling, you went to BCIT, but was there any other... Yep. Did you just go straight out of high school?
No. I always liked radio. I always loved it as entertainment. I didn't think that was what I was going to do for a career. In high school, I was more interested in geology and history and politics. Maybe I kind of thought at the time, maybe be a lawyer or go into politics or something like that. And I also loved earth sciences and history. So those were kind of my interests in high school. And I loved radio, but to me, it was a thing that normal people didn't do. I thought they were more famous than they are at the time when I was a kid. So it wasn't till, the summer of my high school or after I graduated that first summer and I was at a house party and, I was buds with the kids, that were a year above me. And, one of the kids was back from his first year of university and we're at this house party. He's talking about this radio show he had on CJSF, the Simon Fraser University station. I was like, oh my God, that sounds so fun. I was also very interested in music. I was a nerd. I bought every compact disc that came out. My dad used to get mad at me because I'd spend my whole, fast food paycheck on CDs and concert tickets. And so I thought that was the greatest. I was like, man, I'd love to have a radio show once a week. And the guy was not helpful. He was just sort of like, yeah, you can't do it. You got to go to SFU. And that was that. But I had another friend that went to UBC that fall, and he was at Frosh Week, and there was a CITR, the UBC radio station, tent. So he signed up as a student, and then was like, will you come co-host it with me? And I ended up just kind of taking over the show. So I started college radio, and I loved it. And I wasn't doing so great at other things I was doing. And so my mom, who was a guidance counselor, was like, oh, they have a radio program at BCIT. That seems to be the only thing you show up for every week. Why don't you try that? So I went to BCIT, took a part-time class with Brian Antonson. And Brian Antonson was like, all right, we'll put you in the full-time program that fall.
Oh, you just made me laugh. What did she say? It's the only thing you bother to show up for?
Yeah, I was one of those kids that, I was more interested in partying than I was in working. And college wasn't really agreeing with me at the time. So that was that.
And you're on a college radio station and you're not even going to that particular...
Yeah, I never went to UBC. I should get an honorary degree. I went there for 5 years. I hung out at CITR. I went to everything except classes.
That's fantastic. And so
I loved it. CITR was the best.
Did you get to play your own stuff? Did you bring in some of your own CDs?
My show was at 4 a.m. and went from 4 a.m. till 8 at the beginning. and I just worked my way up. We felt like we hit the big time when I got Friday night at midnight, because back then people, cool people listened to CITR, and Friday night was the time to be on because that's when everyone was partying. And if you went to like a house party out in Vancouver in the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone, they would just put on the radio, and they would put on CITR, or there was a show on CBC called
Brave New Waves.
Yeah, Brave New Waves. I was going to say Breaking with Brave New Waves. So either or was on. If you went to a house party, just cranked out, or there'd be some weird band in the corner playing. So that was a great time. I loved being on Friday night, and I thought that was I didn't know a lot about commercial radio, so I thought Friday night was the best time. I was like, why would people choose to be morning radio?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so then you're up and you're signed up for BCIT at that point. Yeah. Shortly after. Yeah. How long did you have to endure that? And I make it sound like it's terrible, but I hear you've already got the radio bug inside of you, so I can only imagine that learning about it is nutty. Yeah, it was weird for me only in that God bless BCIT, and I'm sure it's changed a lot, but when I started, like the first month is like how to drop a needle on a record. And that stuff drove me really insane. But the Brian Anderson was really good for me. There was a teacher named John Ansel who's passed away now. But they were very like, Jeremy, we know you know this. You're going to get an A. Just can you hang out in class and help those students that don't know how to drop a needle on a record? It would reel-to-reel tape, carts, like all that weird stuff. But in first semester, John Ansel hooked me up with a job at CFOX 1410, which at the time was Talk with Attitude. It was like the last place radio station in Vancouver, run by Chum, I guess at the time, with QMFM. And so I got on as an op, and I did the overnights, the Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell when he used to be on the radio. And so I got working right away. And so I stayed with BCIT for about a year and a half. Me and BCIT were not bros for a little bit, and I had to drop out. And I didn't think commercial radio was for me at the time. I liked working at CFOX, but it paid no money. QMFM, bless it, was not the coolest radio station to ever work for. And commercial radio, at the time, I didn't understand it and I didn't like it. So I kind of stayed doing my college radio show. I was in a band. It's kind of a skid. Okay, so what are the CDs that you're buying? Because I'm trying to get a profile of who you are and what you're listening to at this time.
Well, in the 90s, it would have been anything on CFOX, which was the main rock and roll radio station in Vancouver. So I had like all the one-hit wonders,
Refreshments.
Marvelous 3, The Refreshments. What's that?
Harvey Danger.
Harvey Danger, the band that does the song Nerf Herder, whatever they are called.
Fastball.
Fastball. Yeah, I had all those jams, Tonic. I loved it. Anything 90s, all that stuff, I loved it. And then once I got into college radio, man, I was so into indie rock and punk rock and metal, like just full on. And so, I went to every show and had every CD and all that early 2000s emo, screamo stuff. Loved it all.
Nerf Herder.
Yeah, Nerf. I bought Van Halen one. It was the best damn record I ever owned. Yeah, it's the best.
So when did you shape up?
Well, I was living like a skid for a bit, and that was fun. And once again, my mom was like, can you please, you have one semester. Can you go back to school for one semester? And I was working at a hotel at the time in downtown Vancouver, had my college radio show, had my band. And, being 20, I was 20, whatever, 20 nothing, 21, 22. And so I thought that was fine, but I was like, sure, one semester. I can go back for one semester. So I went back for that last semester, and you have to do a practicum. So I sent my demo out all over the place, every small town in BC and in Western Canada. I ran into an old boss at CFOX who was working for Mojo Radio in Vancouver. 730 back in the day was so if CFOX was Talk with Attitude, it was like a women-focused talk. Mojo was men's talk, which was popular in that, early mid-2000s. So he said, I could get you on at Mojo for your practicum, but I don't recommend it. Go anywhere else. So I sent a demo to Hawaii, Kapoi, and the Zone in Victoria. I had a buddy named Scott Kirkwood working there. So the only two radio stations that got back to me other than Mojo 730 was Hawaii and Victoria. So then I had to pick. And my mom was like, hey, you should go to Hawaii. You know, my parents were like, go to Hawaii for a month. That sounds awesome. But I was like, no, I'll just go to Victoria because I have couches to crash on. So I went to Victoria on the Zone. And then on my first day, Lane Mitchell quit. He was doing mornings on the Zone. And so Al Ford, who was the program director at the time, was like, oh my God, I can't deal with you, kid who I don't know. You'll hang out in the evenings with my bud, Scott Kirkwood, who was doing nights. And, I'll sign whatever you need to sign to graduate. And I thought that was fine. And then it was hockey playoff season. So Scott Kirkwood wanted to watch hockey in the newsroom. So he's like, do some breaks for me while I watch hockey. Al Ford heard the breaks. He's like, what are you doing on the radio? I'm so mad. And so I'm sorry. I just did what the guy told me. He's like, well, I'll talk to Scott Kirkwood tomorrow in my office and you can keep doing nights. So there we go.
Did Scott keep his job?
Scott got promoted to middays.
Oh, okay. Good.
Yeah. Scott now had a relationship at the time. You'd have to interview Scott now to find out more about that.
Yeah, the first time I heard Lane Mitchell, it was on the Zone, and he made a departure. I guess he's going to Edmonton at that point.
You'd have to kind of get Lane. Have you had Lane on the show?
No, and that's again. I this is supposed to be a temporary show that we're going to do a few episodes for.
Right.
And then I realized, well, I haven't heard this person's story and that person's story. So I guess that's another reminder that I have to have Lane on the show.
You know what? I'd love to hear Lane's take on it. Basically, he quit for reasons. I don't know why, but it was like sudden. He came back and then did another year at the Zone and then went to Sonic.
Gotcha.
So I think he was going to leave radio or go to college. I can't remember. Like, he was young too. Like, we're all in our early 20s.
There were some pretty cool people who were working at that station at the time.
At the Zone, yeah.
And I only do this, and I'm remembering because 2003, I think I went to Canadian Music Week and met a whole bunch of people from the Zone who were all fresh and great ideas, and some of the people were doing production, and just a fun radio station with a lot of creativity.
Oh yeah, it was a definitely righteous time. Radio was different back then. Modern rock was beginning to have a time. The rock stations in Canada were, I wouldn't say stale, but they're definitely big tent style rock and roll. X had come to Vancouver and kind of blown out, and CFOX at that time was very just kind of mainstream meat and potatoes rock and roll. The Zone and Victoria weirdly had two modern rock stations at the time. Extreme, that's where Todd Hancock got his start, and then the Zone. And when I showed up, it had been Lane Mitchell in the mornings, but they moved Paul Brown, who's been on the radio for a lot of years, especially in Edmonton. If you listen to The Bear, Paul Brown did mornings. Scott Kirkwood did middays. Sarah P. did afternoons, and then I did evenings, and James Sutton was brought on right around that time as well.
Why does all that work in Victoria? I mean, legendary stations like the Q, the Zone works, other signals coming into the market. Why does it work in Victoria? Because all that we hear about the rest of Canada is it's a great place to go and retire and have tea at the Empress at 4 in the afternoon.
Victoria's a lot younger than people. Yeah, like the saying is newlywed, nearly dead, right? It's not just like nearly dead. It's newlywed, nearly dead. So Victoria's also really young. Like, there's a huge university. There's the Navy and there's the government, and they employ like young university educated people. And it's touristy, so there's a lot of hospitality that employs young people, young vibrant art people, and a lot of arts. And then you are on an island, so it has its own kind of art scene. You have to kind of make your own fun for sure. I think the Zone secret sauce early on definitely was being part of the Q. At the time, it was owned by a small independent, a couple oil guys from Fort McMurray owned it. And so they had the Q, and the Q was like, dominant station, Ed Bain, Cliff LeCain, Kirk Mason, all those guys. They were, and still are legends, but at that time they were number one with a bullet. Zone was brand new. And they were able to subsidize the Zone in those days, I think. You'd have to talk to the business
compliment,
guys. But,
I think, would probably be
compliment.
Yeah.
Compliment. You have Al Ford on the show sometime, or Mark Adams, or John Shields. They'll tell you about it.
And you spent like nearly 12 years there. So you started off on the sofa or the couch because you're Canadian, and you worked your way through what positions?
So I did evenings for a year and a half, 2 years. And then basically what happened was the small company that owned the Zone got a license in Edmonton. And so Al Ford went out there to start Sonic. The company was quite small, and so he couldn't bring everyone, obviously. They had to leave some people at the Zone. So there was a bit of a, schism, I guess. And half the crew went out to Edmonton and half stayed in Victoria. So everyone bounced up. It was kind of real good. At that point, Rick Lee was working, doing afternoons on the Zone. And so it was, they had Lane doing mornings, and they brought Shippy out there to do production. And I think Sarah Morton might have went out there to run the office. Al Ford went, and then Rick Lee was kind of humming and hawing whether he wanted to go to Edmonton or stay. So in the end, he went, and I got Rick Lee's job. So I got afternoons, and then I did that for forever. Yeah, did afternoons there till 2014, and kind of worked. I did a lot of stuff. I did production for a little bit. I wasn't very good at it, but I helped out, and ended up kind of being like, they call it an assistant music director, but for the most part, our music director kind of acted like the program director, and I was the assistant music director, but I was like the music director. I don't know.
I just love. I
worked all the time.
You use the word schism, which means you've played a lot of Tool.
Oh yeah, for sure. That was an awesome record.
What about bands that come to Victoria? Did you get a lot of concerts coming through? I sort of get the feeling that Vancouver gets them all, but
yeah,
did you just get the smaller bands to come over to Victoria?
Yeah, yes and no. It's hard to say, and I mean, every Canadian city and people rocking this podcast across the country are going to complain. Like, unless you're Toronto, you're going to complain about bands skipping your town.
I was in Montreal, and we complained about bands going to only Toronto. So
100%, right? Yeah. Like bands don't even come to Montreal. So yes, not every show comes to Victoria, but Victoria does have a very active and vibrant art scene. It had some very progressive and proactive concert promoters, independent concert promoters. So we got shows. I mean, the Killers came, played the arena. I remember Tool came, Queens of Stone Age, like some pretty big bands played Victoria. There's lots of legendary tales, especially before my time, of Pearl Jam playing in Victoria, Nirvana, and Alice in Chains. Green Day played at the park downtown in the band shell. Those things happened. And then, of course, they started a festival there in the later years. I was there called Rifflandia, and tons of artists came through there.
Yeah, and so I was going to talk a little bit about Seattle, because you're within earshot of KISW and 107.7 The End. And I guess that's kind of why I'm surprised that so much of that great music can live sort of on the band all at once. I've had Kathy Faulkner on here, but I can totally see why Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam should come to Victoria. It's within earshot of those Seattle stations, but also your station.
Yeah, Red Hot Chili Peppers play. I remember I interviewed Red Hot Chili Peppers one time in Vancouver. I'm like, hey, man, tell me a memory you have of Vancouver. And they're like, yeah, taking the ferry to Victoria. So the bands love it when they do come. It's just, nowadays, and just there's challenges of being on an island and doing a show. But yeah, those Seattle stations don't come in to Victoria as much as maybe people think. They're very fuzzy. You got to be on the south part of Victoria to get the Seattle stations. I think if anything, people listen. There's one out of Bellingham. I think it's KZOK or something like that.
Yeah.
People listen to that more in the Lower Mainland or Victoria than some of the Seattle ones. They don't come in as well as people think.
Okay.
We actually, the Zone shot into, we had a lot of listeners in Washington State.
Yeah.
Because we kind of shot across the water into the rural parts of Washington State, where all the farms are, and around Bellingham and Olympic Peninsula.
And for those who don't know, Victoria is the capital of British Columbia. But talk a little bit about the ferry, just so that because people think British Columbia, they only really think of Vancouver. So give people a little idea about where how to get there from Vancouver.
Yeah, if you're in Vancouver, you have to take a ferry boat, and it's not a long ride. It's an hour and a half from Victoria or from Vancouver, but it's a hassle and it's expensive. It's not a cheap date for working people. So when you're in Victoria, when I first moved there as a kid, I went back and forth all the time. And there's times in my life where I more or less commuted, and you can do it, but it's not fun. So once you live in Victoria, or once you live in Vancouver, you really just kind of go back and forth when you need to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
You have to get to the ferry an hour and a half early, sit there. It's an hour and a half. And the ferry terminal in Vancouver is like, it's not in Vancouver. It's like in deep suburb.
Yeah.
And the ferry terminal in Victoria is like at the top of the Saanich Peninsula. It's like a 40-minute drive out of town.
How'd you get to CFOX in Vancouver in 2015?
I got a message from, I got a message from Drex, first of all people. Drex messaged me and he was like, hey man, would you be interested in coming to CFOX? And that was just out of nowhere. And I was like, yes, I would. So
what was he doing at the time?
he was doing evenings, and I guess Ronnie Stanton and Dustin Collins, who were running it at the time, they had heard me because the zone does shoot into the Lower Mainland.
Yep.
And they were making changes at CFOX at that time, changing the music. There was a lot going on. I mean, you could have, if you haven't had Ronnie or Dustin on, man, that'd be an interesting chat, I think, for a lot of broadcasters, just kind of what they did with CFOX and what needed to happen with Course at that time in Course Vancouver. But they made a lot of changes, and I was part of those changes.
I was part of those changes too in Winnipeg, but at the wrong end.
Yes, right. So it's always an interesting thing to talk about, but I was on the other side of those changes. And I was working for Pattison at the time. I wanted to work at the Peak so badly. I applied there like 40 times. No, that's an exaggeration, but I applied there a few times, and they just were not interested in me. And so when Course was like, messaged me and was like, hey, we would like to pay you double what you're making in Victoria. I said, okay. And that was easy.
Yeah.
Took a week.
I have had Ronnie on the show before.
Yeah, Ronnie's got some takes.
Yeah, we may have, and I'm going to have him on again because he's working now in Europe, and they're doing so well with radio in Europe, and I'd like to bring him on at some point to talk about why they're succeeding and why we're failing. So,
yeah, Ronnie's the man. He's doing Virgin, like head of like Virgin International or something now.
That's right.
Crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah,
he's just like a radio whisperer.
And so, those changes also included, I think, the departure of Todd Hancock, which led to him going and starting his podcast, of which I think he's like episode number 2 on this very series for anybody who wants to go back and hear what it's like to be on the other end of that story. But you get into CFOX, part of these great changes that are going on radio wise. So what did you bring to CFOX, and what were some of those changes, and how did the station sort of evolve in 2015?
Well, for me at the time, it was very scary. I'd only really been on the zone. And personally, at that point in my life, I was feeling very stunted. I kind of got as high up in Pattison, I think, as I could go. Dylan and Jason were smashing in the morning zone. I wasn't going to get that job ever. And they weren't interested in me at the Peak. And I was, at that point in my life, had some young kids and was hustling like 40 jobs, just to make ends. Like the zone didn't pay me very much. I just kind of got by. And so I had to work like every weekend. I DJ'd around Victoria mostly to make ends meet. And that was fun. I like DJing is a super fun job, but it was starting to grind on me for sure. And so when I came to CFOX, it felt really good that they reached out to me, but I was also very nervous and very scared because I didn't know. But Ronnie and Dustin were so lovely to me, and Britters and everyone that worked there. They were like, no, man, we listened to you on the zone. Just do your show on the zone on CFOX. Like, we want that. We found your show and we liked it, and we want you to do that, and don't not do that. So they kind of helped me early on feel comfortable. And everyone at Chorus at that time was very lovely. All the guys at Rock 101 were really nice, and everyone at CFOX was quite supportive. So that made me feel good. And then once I kind of was settled in, that's when Ronnie and Dustin kind of opened up the hood a bit and tinkered on the show. But I mean, they just tinker. They don't tell you what to do. They just give you insight. They give you any market research or data that they have to help your show be better. But that's kind of what they did.
So you've been at the zone, and now you're at CFOX. What do you fundamentally see as was the evolution of radio through that period? Were the breaks shorter? Were the bits shorter? Were the bands? What's the relationship with the music?
Yeah, I guess at the time, that was maybe during an era with really short breaks. That's kind of when they were, I don't know why, but even though I think a lot of data does point that people like the personalities and good talk tends to win, like I don't like to say talk wins because bad talk is a big turn off, obviously, but good talk, compelling talk is a winner. But I don't know. So early on, I think I was kind of focused on like being super tight. But once again, Ronnie and Dustin were like, no, just do your thing. Like if you make me not want to turn off the radio, then you're doing your job. Musically, Ronnie and Dustin were all about maybe not letting too much personal energy get in the way of the music and letting the audience, like not telling the audience what they like. And that's probably one of the best lessons I've ever taken, maybe from Ronnie and Dustin and CFOX in general, was that they had a plan. It was kind of based in the science that they understood it at the time, and then they were focused on it. And when it was winning, and it won my whole time there, so it was a good place to work. It's fun when you win.
And your time ends there in 2021.
Yeah.
Which is we're about a year after the pandemic. And
pandemic was still kind of happening a little bit. It was the tail end of it for sure.
Yeah. Was there some musical chairs going on in the market that sort of precipitated your move to the Peak?
Yeah. So at CFOX earlier, Ronnie had left to go to the U.S. He worked for a company out of California, I think Alpha, maybe?
He worked at Alpha Media, and I think it was based out of Portland. It's actually...
Oh, sure. Yeah, but he lived in California. But so he went to Alpha. So Dustin stepped up, took over that role, which was great. And then one day, in I can't remember when, 2020 or something like that, Dustin left to go run the Peak. And Ronnie came back. So for me, it would, it's always, when your boss leaves, you're dead, right? Like you're dead every time. And in my case, I was very fortunate. Like, in fact, I'd get the news, and usually Ronnie's like, I'm leaving. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting fired. He's like, no, Dustin's going to be the boss. Cool. And then Dustin left, and I was like, oh my God, I'm getting fired. And Brad, who's running Chorus at the time, was like, no, Ronnie's coming back. So, okay, good. So that was nice. So Dustin had left to go to the Peak, and he was there for a little while. And then they let Tyler and Lynch go in the mornings, and we're making some changes there. And that's when Dustin said, messaged up when he was able to, and we were able to chat a little bit about it. And he had this idea for a morning show of putting me and Karis Hogg, who had been on, OG Jeff O'Neill show back in the, 2000s, when Jeff O'Neill show really started rocketing to the fame that they enjoyed to this day.
Establishing heritage.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of market research is going to point to that being generally a winning idea. The Peak, awesome radio station, super fun, but was maybe a little too nerdy, and that was kind of reflected in the ratings. And one thing that Dustin and Ronnie were kind of about were, playing music that people want to hear, and not telling them what they want to hear necessarily. And so Dustin had this kind of plan for the Peak to make like a real modern rock. Like modern rock wins in so many cities, right? Like Indie and X and Sonic, and all through the U.S. And then just in Vancouver, for whatever reason, it hadn't. So Dustin had this plan, and it was an opportunity for me. I always wanted to do mornings in Vancouver. That was my goal, my dream when I started. And so we went to the Peak, and then it happened for a little while.
And there you were back on Pattison after,
Yeah, and I was so psyched. I've been a soldier for Pattison for 100 years. I've made no money for them. And I'm like, finally I get a contract. This is great.
Sometimes you do have to leave in order to come back.
For sure. For a lot of people, I would have a different take personally, but
yeah, you can go ahead and take a swig of that water. We may or may not.
Coffee. That's all I drink. I drink 400 coffees a day.
We may or may not. Yeah, we may or may not edit it out. How do you take your coffee, by the way?
Like with 100 ounces of cinnamon flavored creamer.
Really?
Oh yeah, love cinnamon. I could eat cinnamon everything. If I could live in a land made of churros, I would.
Churros?
Yeah, just cinnamon. Anything cinnamon toast crunch is the best cereal.
All right.
Yeah, I love it.
A pandemic, I mean, we've talked about it on this show so often, we don't need to revisit what happened. I think we all have a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
But tell me about the demise of 102.7 The Peak and why it stopped. And as we are recording this, we should sort of stress it's also back.
He's also back. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. Like I was the morning show and stuff sort of happened, but these decisions kind of get made at a pay grade above radio DJ. So it's hard for me to know exactly what they were thinking. But it was an example of Dusty came into the office one day and is like, I am no longer with Pattison. And me and Karis were like, okay, we're done. And a couple of days later, it all started shaking out. My understanding was they had this now format which worked in Edmonton and they believed it would work in Vancouver, but they just kind of believed it or wished it. And they blew up the peak, and I don't know, once again, you might have to talk to some insiders at Pattison to get the full story. My take was that obviously people at Pattison Vancouver were not psyched on this decision. And it was hard and it was not fun. And it was especially challenging because I'd just come over from CFOX and months later they're blowing, like we hadn't had an opportunity to do our show. And I was like, man, if you guys had any planning, I could have still be at CFOX working.
Yeah. Was there any inclination or something inside of you that said, boy, I wish they'd kept me around for this format, or it's just part of that new format that they bring in to blow everybody else and then just bring in all these fresh bodies. And I've always found it weird that we're going to bring in the format, but we're going to also dust off all these other people.
I don't think they had a ton of research, would probably be my take. They, I think were coming from a place of emotion when they made this format flip, and they brought in guys who weren't my guy. Like me and Karis we were like, okay, well, sure, me and Karis could do conversation radio. They had us listed to the now announcers in the other markets, and we're like, oh my God, yeah, we can talk about nothing for an hour or 4 hours, whatever you want. And they had people that thought rock jocks couldn't do now. And so then they kind of thought about keeping us as an online show. But Karis and I know the business, and what they were paying us was not going to work for an online streaming radio station long term. So we did that for a little bit, but that had an end date. They were pretty honest about that. They weren't. They didn't. At least locally at the Pattison Vancouver, they didn't lie to us too much. They were like, "Here's what's up," and we need, Karis is a working mom and I'm a working parent. We need the job. So we worked on this internet radio station, and it had really good ratings, streaming numbers. So JR was kind of going through a thing at the time. Now's ratings collapsed. And the one area of growth when we'd have ratings meetings would be the peak streaming numbers. And me and Karis would just kind of laugh and be like, cool, man. So yeah, that's what happened. And they pieced us out, and that was that.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that most of these companies took this step to go and put this form of radio on the radio, because I think anytime something new is introduced to people, it's a good thing. But the fact that people have not grabbed onto these formats, whether it's Winnipeg, Toronto, Vancouver, and really only Edmonton has really been the success story with this, which they put on the air many, many years ago.
They put on, launching a radio station, a new brand in this era is going to be a challenge for sure. And that's what I mean. I don't think they fully appreciated that at the time. Just unfortunately, they kind of used everyone that was working at the peak as their learning lessons, and hopefully they got those lessons. But yeah.
Yeah, I've seen a few cases in the last number of years where it's like, let's get rid of this. No, now let's bring it back. So
yeah, for sure.
Tough to fault people for it's tough to fault people for trying. But at the same time, I think the lesson is now out there is that if you've got a brand that's already established, stick with it and take care of it as much as possible.
Yeah, 100. And, you'll have Ronnie stand on the show. He'll talk about that for sure. It was unfortunate. They kind of used the workers a little bit, maybe like fantasy football players a little bit to test this stuff out. But yeah, you got to put your helmet on, and I don't think they had the stomach for it, and so then the peak comes back, but it's not the same peak.
And then you travel across Canada.
Yeah, an opportunity came up while I was on the beach to go to Halifax. Jeff Brown was doing the mornings on Surge 105 with Amy Chabot, and he had a stroke. And so they needed someone just to, the station was fairly new and the morning show was very new. And they're like, oh my God, we're just launching a new brand, and they need someone. And my name came up. So I went out there for a 5-month contract. And yeah, it was awesome.
So that was always going to be a short contract that you were going out there to do that? Or?
Yeah, it was like a 5-month medical leave contract, which I was quite happy with. And then they were like, okay, and if you love it, we want you to stay. We'll find a job for you. If Jeff gets better, we'll find a job for you. If Jeff doesn't get better, it's your morning show. And I said, okay, cool. I don't think I want to move to Halifax full time, but I'll give it a shot. And I brought my family out over the summer. But when September rolled around, it wasn't looking like Jeff was going to be back in time. So they wanted me to stay, but I had a life back in the suburbs of Vancouver with my wife and kids. And I was like, I gotta come back. And I could do it remotely. And they were like, no, live and local. And I get it and respect that, of course. Like, that's what you want radio stations to do. So I was going to come back in September, but they hadn't found a new forever host yet. So I ended up signing a bunch of short-term 2-month contracts while they were finding a forever host. And so I did it for another 5 months remotely from Coquitlam. So waking up at midnight and hopping on with Amy at 1, and the show went live at 2 a.m. Pacific time, and I had a radio show in the middle of the night.
Okay, so I was just about to make jokes about that, because a lot of people don't know that it is a while. It's 4 hours. It is wild. So for those who in other parts of the world who don't have to deal with time zones in a country as big as Canada, Vancouver and Halifax is nearly as far apart as you can get without bringing Newfoundland into this.
Oh yeah, it's like 6,000 kilometers from Vancouver to Halifax.
Right. So if you wanted to go to Halifax, you get on a plane in Vancouver at 9. You're arriving at 6 o'clock at night in Halifax, and your day
it's
is
later.
over.
It's later.
Yeah, even later than that.
Like I would get on a plane when I was flying, because I went back and forth throughout the summer. And flying from Halifax to Vancouver is cool because you're chasing the time zones. So you do your 6-hour flight, but 4 hours later you're in Vancouver. It's awesome. Mm-hmm. But the reverse would be like, oh man, I'd get on a plane, 9, and I'd get to Halifax at 11 o'clock that night.
Yeah.
It was wild.
Yeah.
And then be on the radio the next morning.
And we should stress that show that you were doing, that's a morning show. So you're getting up at midnight. And
getting up at midnight here.
2 a.m.
Yeah, going live. And it was early on. I had the energy for it, but over it was 5.5 months. The grind kind of took over.
And I should stress, or at least mention, that the station that you were working at was Surge 105.
Yeah.
And it was Acadia Broadcasting.
Yep, Acadia Broadcasting.
So shout out to Scott Pettigrew, who's there, who I had a chance to work with in Winnipeg. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremy Slattery's the program director. Yeah, they were awesome. I loved it. It was super fun.
Awesome. But tell me about your impressions of Halifax, because I got to experience some of it, not necessarily by listening to your show, but by experiencing, what you were seeing in social media. And I thought, well, that's a long way for someone to go to do radio, to travel across the country. There, not too many people are moving around the country anymore, for jobs. But you went a long way. And was it your first time out east?
I had been there in 1998, when I was talking about being a skid back in the day. Me and my friends drove across the country,
What, to go see Sloan?
Yeah, living in ditches and stuff. And Halifax was fun, but I was 18. It was, where's the bar that's 3 levels of bar downtown Halifax?
Lower deck, upper deck.
Yeah,
right?
lower deck. That's what we were into at the time. Where's Pizza Corners?
King of Donair.
Yeah. Halifax is awesome. It's like a bizarro world Victoria, really. It's just punk rock Victoria.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, I'm a history guy, so there's a giant fort right downtown. Right downtown Halifax, there's a giant star fort. And I love all that stuff. Everywhere you go in Halifax, you throw a rock, you hit a fort. It's like you go into a park and there's old battlements. It's great. So I loved all that stuff. I love Halifax feels more like a big city compared to Victoria, even though they're very similar sized. Halifax has it's old Canada. It's like you're walking downtown and
That's where the Royal Bank started in 1792. You know, you're just like, what is happening? So there's a lot of old buildings and then a lot of new buildings. They keep the old ones and then they shoot new ones out of the top. The city likes to party and they love sports, which is great. I love sports, and they support they don't have pro leagues. They just have the, Canadian Premier League of Soccer and Quebec Major Junior kind of stuff. And
you got that. Well, Halifax Mooseheads, is that still a thing?
It's a Wanderers. Yeah, Mooseheads are awesome. Yeah, Mooseheads were the Q team. It was great. I loved it.
You got your hat on there for the...
yeah, it's a soccer team, yeah.
Yeah, as well. That's also why St. Mary's University does very well for football as we await the arrival of the CFL Schooners.
Yeah, oh man, that's all
we've been waiting now for 40 years for that to happen.
Yeah, what was it, the 70s they started talking about that?
Yeah. And
it's got to happen. I don't understand it. Like, if I'm the CFL, I would have had a team there yesterday. Then they would win attendance record in the whole league that first year.
Do they have a facility?
They don't, but they don't care. They'd be like, bring your lawn chair, and 10,000 people would bring a lawn chair every week.
That might be the problem.
No, it's not a problem. The soccer stadium is like shipping containers and like high school bleachers, and it's like 6,000, 5,000 people.
Yeah, there's enough money down there between Sobeys and Irving and to make that happen.
Yeah, that's who owned the Surge, Irving.
There you go. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, Halifax is rad. It was a great place. Party town.
And then you had to head back.
Yeah, I did bring my family out. We did a summer. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs of Halifax, and the family came out. But at the end of the day, home was here in BC. So my wife has a job. My kids are all in school. My daughter's a high school age. So, she wanted to finish high school and all that stuff. So, I went out there thinking we could move to Halifax, but ultimately we did not.
Interesting. And when you say suburbs, is that Bedford? Is that Dartmouth where you're living?
I was still in Halifax proper. I lived all over the place. I lived downtown the first month I was there, and I lived in the North End, which is kind of the hipster neighborhood, which was great. Loved it. In Scott Pettigrew's son's basement suite.
Nice.
And
old school radio. I love it.
Oh yeah, it was awesome. Scott put me up in his son's basement suite and way out in the North End, right at the end almost. And then I moved. I can't remember. It was Halifax town, but right at the very end, Bears Lake.
Yep,
Bears Lake area.
Not too far where MBS.
Near Costco.
Well, the Costco and also Maritime Broadcast, I think, has their building out near that area.
Oh, yeah, they might have. Have out there. So, yeah, that was awesome. I was out, by the Bears Lake Road or something like that, Lacewood Drive. And it was great. My kids played with the local kids, ran around, and, it was awesome. We went down to their harbor and got ice cream and went to Cape Breton Island and Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, Montreal, or we didn't go to Montreal, Quebec City. It was awesome.
Hey, did you take the bridge to PEI?
Yeah, the ferry was always broken.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Isn't it great? You can actually get to an island and not have to deal with a ferry.
Oh, for sure. But they still run the ferry, I think, just for fun. I don't know, for cutesies, but it's broken. The whole summer I was there, all it was like, oh, propeller broke. It'll be down for 3 weeks. And I'm like, okay, well, clearly you don't need it. You don't need the ferry, so get rid of it. But whatever. That's a maritime thing. They can sort that out.
And in the full circle moment of the whole thing, here you are, you're back at the Zone.
I had a chance to go back to the Zone and working, kind of doing a little half day midday show. Yeah.
How do you do a half day midday show?
Well, it's like 10 to 12. It's just a 2-hour show.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not like the midday 10 to 2 sort of thing.
Good to be back.
Yeah, I love it. The Zone's the best. Victoria's awesome.
And Victoria too?
Yeah, I broadcast from where I'm doing the podcast right now. But it gives me an excuse to go to Victoria more, and I love it. And maybe we'll end up back on the island one day.
Tell me a little bit about what you see for the future of radio. Do you have any hot takes or anything that you want to share?
Hot takes. Wow. It's challenging. Well, I'm sure you've had a few people on the podcast that have talked about that a bit. I don't know.
I don't know if I have a hot take.
Because you've done a lot, aside from moving markets,
sure.
but you've also had dabbled in streaming.
Yeah.
We're recording a podcast now. Do you see anything that maybe radio could use, or any tips that they could pick up to really sort of, boost the medium?
Well, I was listening to your podcast. Was it the last dude named Jeremy?
Yeah, it's only chance, by the way, that we have two Jeremys in a row. But
yeah. Okay. So he was kind of talking about, and I agreed with his take where he said, radio does not do a great job of sharing their content digitally. So what I have been inspired by is non-radio people who do a radio show on the internet. Podcasting, for example. And you do a podcast where it's like about a thing, and a lot of people do that. A lot of podcasts like, oh, listen to the real estate podcast or whatever, right? But there are a lot of performers, and I'm starting to, I guess, treat myself more as an entertainer and less like a radio DJ. There are a lot of entertainers online who basically do radio breaks. They do bits. And that's all radio people do. But radio people don't put them on the internet. And so I think other people are kind of drinking their milkshake, to use the old saying from the, whatever that movie was. Like, I'm going to drink your milkshake. And Daniel Day-Lewis. And I think a lot of people have been drinking radio's milkshake. And I think radio needs to kind of take it back a little bit. And I feel like maybe there's a lot of programming right now that feels, to use a sports analogy, they're coaching not to win. They're coaching not to lose, right? They're not coaching to win. They're coaching not to lose. And when you cheer on your favorite sports team and you see your team doing that, you're going to lose ultimately, right? The other team's going to score 2 goals in the last 3 minutes.
Yeah, the prevent defense, which never works.
It just prevents you from winning. And I'm sure there's stats that say, no, prevent defense works more than fans think. But it doesn't matter. If fans think that it sucks, it sucks. So a lot of radio programming right now seems to be more like managing collapse more than aiming to win. And so I've been kind of taking a lot of my cues lately from performers who kind of do a lot, basically do radio bits, but do it on the radio. And there are some radio people that do it, right? I'm really inspired by Coulter, right? From The Edge. He got so popular at doing his bits on TikTok, he left radio.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Or I look at Lauren Hunter at Sonic. It's to me, she's more of an online entertainer than a radio DJ. It's she's an online entertainer who also has a part-time job on the radio. I know that's not the case, but that's almost what it feels like.
Yeah, it feels like perception-wise. And I had that experience too, because I met there was a young girl, she was, I think, 14, 15, and I mentioned Shannon Burns. And she goes, oh, I follow her on TikTok. She's my favorite. I said, do you know she's on the radio? It's no, didn't know that.
Yeah, look at Jax in Toronto would be another great example.
Yeah.
She's not on the radio. Did she lose her job on the radio?
Yes.
I wouldn't know it because her content is still so good. It might be better than when she was on the radio.
Yeah.
So that is, I've been inspired by that, but now I follow a lot of comedians and a lot of performers. And the one thing that I'm picking up from them is basically we're, our little podcast screen here. I got my microphone. I get my hot take. It's a minute. It's a minute and a half. It's 45 seconds, like a radio break. And that's, to me, how I'm consuming media right now. It's who I want my target audience to be is consuming media. And I think that's kind of a place where I want to be and get better at and keep learning and growing. So I find now when I'm reaching out for insight on, how I want to make my videos, often I'm reaching out to entertainers and comedians as much as radio DJs, and I'm only really reaching out to radio DJs if they're already doing that. You know what I mean? If it's like Alex Carr or other people kind of doing that. Meredith is doing that a lot as well. Yeah. Meredith Geddes, and to me that works really well.
Jeremy, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to me.
Thanks, Matt. I know you're an online creator. I get all my, I don't know if I've ever listened to a Matt Cuddle podcast beginning to end, but I've listened to
100 bits of Matt Kundle podcast.
Thanks, man. Love it.
All right. Thank you so much, you guys.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.